A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and he stayed close to the sea. One of the synagogue officials named Jairus came forward. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, saying, "My daughter is at the point of death. Please come lay your hands on her, that she may get well and live." He went off with him, and a large crowd followed him, pressed upon him. There was a woman afflicted with hemorrhages for 12 years. She had suffered greatly at the hands of many doctors, and had spent all she had. Yet she was not helped, but only grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. She said, "If I but touch his clothes, I shall be cured." Immediately her flow of blood dried up. She felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Jesus, aware at once that power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who has touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to Jesus, "You see how the crowd is pressing upon you, and yet you asked, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. The woman, realizing what had happened to her, approached in fear and trembling. She fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be cured of your affliction." While he was still speaking, people from the synagogue official's house arrived and said, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" Disregarding the message that was reported, Jesus said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid, just have faith." He did not allow anyone to accompany him inside except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they arrived at the house of the synagogue official, he caught sight of a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. So he went in and said to them, "Why this commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they ridiculed him. Then he put them all out. He took along the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and entered the room where the child was. He took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." The girl, a child of 12, arose immediately and walked around. At that, they were utterly astounded. He gave strict orders that no one should know this, and said that she should be given something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord. He touched me. He put his hand near mine, and then he touched me. I felt a sudden tingle when he touched me, a sparkle, a glow. He knew it. It wasn't accidental. He smiled and seemed to tell me so all through it. He knew it, I know. He touched me. Control myself and try to act as if I remember my name, but he touched me. And suddenly, nothing is the same. It may seem like that is a nice, poetic commentary on today's gospel. It is, however, a popular song sung by Barbra Streisand several years ago, actually many years ago. And actually, I've always liked that song and haven't heard it in ages and ages and ages and ages. And then a week or so ago, I'm driving in the car and it came on the radio. And I listened to it, it was wonderful. But then it got stuck in my head. You know how annoying it is when you get a song stuck in your head and you can't get rid of it? And it just kept playing and playing over in my head and couldn't figure out why it got stuck. But then I read this gospel in preparation for today, and I understood why it got stuck. In a way, it really is, for me, a commentary on what happened in the gospel today. Very important gospel, a very wonderful gospel. We have two stories: the story of the daughter of the synagogue official and the story of the woman with the hemorrhage. And I'd like to concentrate on the woman with the hemorrhage for a second, because I think, for me, that's the real core of this story. Here we have a woman who was sick, a chronic illness. And many of us know what it's like to have a chronic illness, whether it be diabetes, COPD, arthritis, asthma, diabetes, constant chronic pain. We know what it's like. We know how debilitating it can be. Those days when we can barely get out of bed in the morning. Those days for which nothing exists for us but pain. Now, admittedly, today, we have a lot of remedies for that. You can go to the pharmacy, buy over-the-counter stuff, go to your doctor, get all sorts of wonderful pills, and a lot of that pain can be taken away. But in Jesus' day, for that poor woman, there were no painkillers. And it says that the doctors did her absolutely no good. So here's a poor woman for 12 years living with this chronic illness. And what was worse than that, it was an illness of hemorrhaging. And it doesn't say much in there, but the implication is that it was one of those woman's things. And the thing about that is, those woman's things made her ritually unclean, which means she was forbidden to go to see her family. She couldn't be part of the community. She was an outcast. For as long as those hemorrhages were going on, she could not come in. She no longer had family. She no longer had friends. She couldn't go to the synagogue. She was totally and completely isolated, almost like being a leper. And here she hears about Jesus. If only I touch his cloak. All I have to do is touch his clothes and I will be healed. And she sneaks up behind him in the middle of the crowd and she touches his cloak, and immediately she knows she's healed. She's scared. She's not quite sure what to do, and she kind of hides back, moves back into the crowd. Now Jesus understands that somebody's been healed. And he turns around in the crowd and says, "Who touched me?" Now he's surrounded by a couple of thousand people. And his disciples quite readily said, "What do you mean, who touched you? You got 1,000 people pushing at you, and you said, 'Who touched you?'" But Jesus would not be deterred. Who touched me? He had to speak to her. Because Jesus understood that illness is not simply of body, illness of mind and spirit. Those of us who suffer from chronic diseases, chronic pain, you know what that is. You know how much you suffer, not only in body, but in mind and in spirit.